Welcome, everyone. I'm Sue Barber, author, former IT director for a Fortune 500 company, turned executive coach, and this is the Visibility Factor podcast, where we explore how to raise your visibility and play bigger at work and in life. We'll explore key topics and welcome guests that help you shift your thinking about yourself so you can see new possibilities for your leadership. I'm on a mission to create a visibility movement for leaders to show their value and be seen for their true talent. Are you ready to take the next step towards a higher level of visibility for yourself? Let's go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Visibility Factor podcast. This is Sue Barber, your host. I'm so excited today to share my guest with you, Ivonne Furneaux. She is a keynote speaker, a former corporate leader. She has done some amazing things around workplace strategy, and she has her own consulting firm. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So just share a little bit about your background in terms of companies. I know there's a host of them and some big names, but what was your real focus in corporate?
Sure. I started my career at Target Corporation as a business analyst, and I was terrible at it, but I landed eventually in communications because that's where I wanted to be. I went to school for communications. I thought I was going to be a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist someday, and instead I ended up doing corporate communications, but that's okay. I found my passion there. So I was at Target for 5 years. I went on to work for Carlson Companies, which at the time owned Radisson Hotels, Carlson Wagonly Travel, TJ Friday's restaurants, huge private company. And then I had some life changes and decided to pick up and move from Minneapolis to Chicago. I worked for a few different companies after I came here, continuing my career in corporate communications. And over time, I also started taking on some HR type work, employee engagement. And then I started doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work before it was even called diversity, equity, and inclusion. I started the first diversity council when I was at Redbox, which is no longer around. And I was doing employee engagement there too. And so over time, I continued on the path of doing corporate communications as well as doing HR work. I worked my way up to becoming a chief diversity officer at a Fortune 500 real estate company called Anywhere Real Estate, which is the parent company of Coldwell Banker, Century 21, and Sotheby's, among other brands. And then most recently in my corporate career, I was a vice president at WeightWatchers, overseeing internal communications, employee experience, social impact, and DEI. So that role became kind of a culmination of all of the things I had done throughout my career. But along the way, a couple other companies I worked for were companies like OfficeMax. I worked for a company called SSAB, which is a Swedish steel company. So I spent a lot of time working in really different industries, but always from mid to large organizations. And it gave me this really great depth and breadth of experience across a lot of different roles and a lot of different functions. So I had a really great career. And then like so many others, I got laid off and then had to do some soul searching. So, and I know there are so many others out there listening who are in the same boat. So, but there is hope. So that's where I am now. That brings me to now. Yeah.
You're a great example of that. So say a little bit about what your consulting firm does.
Sure. So at Power Up Consulting, we focus on change, communications, and culture in the workplace. So anything from executive messaging and events to creating a communication strategy around employee engagement. So our focus, and I do a lot of speaking on these topics. So the focus really is on how do we build a better workplace with more connection and greater engagement to drive performance.
So needed in the workplace, yes. For sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So you have something in your title on one of your introductory pages that I just think is really great, interesting language. What do you consider a corporate survivalist? And that's how you're referring to yourself. So I'd love to know how you see that.
So you heard from my career journey that I worked at a lot of different places in a lot of different industries. A lot of that was by choice, but some of it was out of survival because inevitably everywhere I went, some kind of big organizational shift happened, whether it was a layoff, a merger, a restructuring. I went through 3 different corporate relocations where I had to make decisions about whether or not I was going to pick up my family and move across the country. So I became kind of this survivalist in the corporate jungle, and trying to figure out how do I manage my career through all of this chaos and change. And through a lot of those changes, I was not just living it, I was leading it. So that's how I kind of coined myself a corporate survivalist, because I figured out how to survive and thrive through all the chaos and change. And it got to a point in my career that my friends would not go work for any company I worked for, because they knew that ultimately something was going to happen. They're like, no, the minute I start there, they're going to announce that they're relocating to Timbuktu or something. No, not going to
Ah,
go
yeah. If that's so okay, not funny, but funny at the same time. I mean, if we only had a crystal ball and could see
Right?
the future, right, for that company.
No.
My old company announced last year that they were going to split again, which is so interesting, having been a person who put it all together and then they were going to split it. And then this morning they announced they're not going to do that anymore. So you just never know what's going to happen. You just have
never
to kind of
know.
go with it. Yeah. So I think you're setting a great example for people to see that there's other paths, that there's always a way, whatever that looks like for you.
Yeah.
So I know that you talk a lot about a concept called ghost gaps, and
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to know how you came up with that, how you figured that out, first of all, which I think is really kind of a cool thing, and what they are.
Sure. So, you heard again throughout my career, I was working on the communication side, but also on the DEI side. So it gave me a very unique insight into how organizations operate and the gaps and disparities and barriers that exist for people within organizations. Um, I say something controversial whenever I talk to folks, and that is that the workplace isn't fair, and we have to get over it. But the workplace isn't fair. The organizations weren't designed to be fair. And as long as we work in kind of this capitalist type of organization and not a nonprofit or for yourself, there are always going to be hierarchies that exist, and there are always going to be disparities in information access and opportunity between different people in different organizations. Two people can work for the same organization, have the same name on the paycheck, but have very, very different experiences working for that company. The person working in finance in the corporate office who's a VP has a very different experience than the person driving a truck or working in a retail store or working in a warehouse, right? They're getting paid very differently. They're existing in different spaces. They have access to different information. So all of those gaps create, like I said, these gaps in access, opportunity, and power. And so that's what I identified as the ghost gaps. They're these invisible divides that kind of define everything about how you experience work. And they really, unfortunately, put barriers around what we can and can't do in the workplace. And so I tell people that it's not fair because it isn't. But once we accept that, we can start to see what those ghost gaps are and then better understand how to either change things in the organization or change things personally about how we navigate our way through the organization. So ghost gaps at their core are really just gaps in access and connection that exist in every workplace. They're haunting every workplace. They're haunting you right now if you're there, and we got to figure out a way to exercise them or at least minimize them.
I love that. I assume the ghost is because they're invisible and most
They're
people don't
invisible.
see them, right?
Exactly. And most importantly, most leaders don't see them, and we don't see them ourselves. We're kind of just trying to navigate our way through this haunted space. But also, I just really love Halloween, so I kind of used it as an excuse to be able to use some kind of Halloween reference in my.
It has to work for you. You're going to talk about it all the time, right?
Exactly.
Maybe you can have little ghosts on your part of your logo somehow, right?
Yeah. I do use them in my presentation. So
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So when we think about this, you just
Mhm.
mentioned, the very different experiences of people in certain parts of the organization, certain
Yeah.
types of jobs. I assume there's a lot of challenges around employee engagement because of these things that maybe people don't even realize exist. So can you talk about some of the research that led you to see how big this issue is?
Sure. Before I get into that, I just want to really define what I mean about identity in the workplace, because I think right now we think about identity in the workplace as things like our race and our gender and even our age. But there's this layer of identity that exists only in the context of the workplace. And I call that your workplace identity or organizational identity. So if we think about our core characteristics of our identity, it is those things like race and gender. That second layer is things that are in your life that are by choice or by chance. It's like whether or not you're married, where you live, if you have kids, your parental status. So those things define us. But again, there's this outer layer of your onion that only exists in the context of the workplace. And that identity is defined by things like what location you work in, what team you're a part of or what department you're in, what level of the organization you're in, how far you are from the top or bottom of the hierarchy, whether or not you're a team leader. All of those things comprise your workplace identity, and they define everything about how you experience work, like I mentioned the example earlier. So I think it's really important to understand the concept of workplace identity, because when we think about identity in the context of the workplace and the things that the workplace creates for our identity, we can start to think about kind of fairness and balance in a new way. And the reality is that in different parts of the organization, people are much more or less disconnected. They have much more or less access to information and much more or less proximity to power. So, a lot of my research has circled around these disparities between the top and bottom of an organization, these divides that exist in organization, some sociological concepts like fault lines and implicit bias and things like that. And so that's all kind of brought me together to kind of this understanding of how workplace identity and employee engagement kind of really collide to drive employee experience and ultimately team performance. I read some really interesting data that stuck with me years ago and I recite it all the time. But, about a quarter of employees in mid to large size organizations do not know what their CEO looks like or even what their name is. So they could not pick them out of a lineup. So if you're a corporate worker and you have exposure to that person all the time, that's going to seem like a really crazy concept to you that 1 in 4 employees at your company can't even name the CEO of your company. We don't all work for a Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg who's in the news all the time, right? And we may work in a location where the CEO never visits. You can go your whole 25-year career working in a factory and never see the CEO once. And so I mention that because it speaks to, the type of connection and disconnection that can exist just by virtue of a workplace identity. And then Gallup has a lot of research around how employee engagement ultimately drives performance. And so, all of these things are interwoven. And that's why it's really important for organizations to really start thinking about these concepts and how they can narrow these gaps and think about identity in a different way. You can level the playing field in your organization. That's great on a personal level, but you can also drive better performance by creating more connection and eliminating a lot of the silos that we create in organizations, either intentionally or unintentionally.
So you just made me think of this really funny story. So way back when, before social media exists as it exists today,
Yeah.
we were in an event and somebody came up to the front and started speaking. I had no idea who it was. It was a CEO, not
Yep.
one of the current ones at all, but it was a CEO. And I thought, how is that possible that we've never even seen him?
Right.
So then fast forward into a different CEO, Irene Rosenfeld, and she was very visible. She would eat in the lunchroom. Everybody got to see her. And what was interesting about the difference was, we didn't know who this other person was at all. So we never got any signs of good or bad things happening. But when Irene would walk down the hallway, if she had an uptight face on or didn't look happy, people inferred things because of that. And so it's an interesting place for a CEO, I would imagine, to
Yeah.
be, where you're trying to appear like everything's great,
Yeah.
everything's wonderful when things really are tough for you.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting to note is that when I talk about your experience as an employee based on identity, it doesn't necessarily mean that things are better or worse at the top or bottom of the organization. I remember having a conversation with a CEO who told me that being a CEO was the loneliest job she'd ever had, because she could never trust that people were being totally honest with her, that people were bringing their authentic selves, because the power dynamic always gets in the way, right? So it can be lonely at the top too. It's interesting because I think there's maybe less empathy for folks the higher up in the food chain they are. But, I just think it's really important to know we're all human. And you bring up a really good point about human connection and how people could relate or not relate to a leader in the organization. I remember I worked with this leader at one organization that I won't name, but he had this reputation for being just really, really mean. And like people would scatter like ants when he came walking down the hallway. They were just like, oh no, what's he going to say to us? And I did a bunch of focus groups in the organization because I was like, I need to get to the bottom of this. Employee engagement scores were low. There were all these signs of mistrust. And it turned out there was some story that had happened in the past that he had supposedly yelled at somebody in a meeting. And the story kind of took on a life of its own because he was kind of introverted. So he didn't make an effort to really get to know people on a human level. So the only story people knew of him was what they had heard through this grapevine and, telephone tag years later, he became the Incredible Hulk in that meeting or something. So, I worked with him to really create a plan of like being more visible, being more present, being more human, being more spontaneous. And over time, you started to see greater trust and engagement build. But, in the absence of leaders creating those connections, people will make their own assumptions and create their own stories in their minds about who they are.
100%. I talk about that
Yeah.
all the time with people because
Yeah.
sometimes they'll say, well, they know who I am. I said, well, when was the last time you talked to them?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, 3 years ago. I said, well, haven't you done some things in the last 3 years that they probably don't know?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we make a lot of assumptions about people and sometimes about ourselves that other
Yes.
people should know us and know our work and know all the things, but that's not always possible. And I really like the way that you're framing the fairness in an organization is something that we just accept as fact, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Because I think so many people are trying to constantly change it, which I'm all for. There's definitely
Mhm.
some needs to change some things for sure, but it isn't an easy thing to change. It's
No.
like we used to call it when we had the two companies and we split them, it was like turning the Titanic in one company and it was a speedboat in the other.
Yeah.
And I think that's very true. A lot of companies, it's so complicated. There's so many pieces and parts
Mhm.
that it's not easy to make those changes happen. Have you seen cultures really change dramatically without splitting a company to do it?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of the organizations I've worked in that have good culture maintain that good culture until something bad happens. And then if their culture was strong to begin with, they can maintain that good culture through the turbulent times. What's interesting to me about culture is that we kind of talk about it as this unique entity that exists. But the reality is that culture is just this ethereal thing that we just exist in an organization, and that is created by the decisions and behaviors and actions of everyone who's existing in that space, right? And you find even when people leave an organization, the remnants of their behavior and decisions can still permeate through the culture, right? And so there's this tendency in organizations like we put culture in HR. HR is responsible for culture. No, actually, everybody creates the culture. The culture just is. It exists as it is. And so to me, organizations that are able to change culture aren't the ones that just create new values and slap them on a poster on the wall. They are the ones that actually evaluate how their leaders are behaving and, change the behavior in order to change the culture. I had an old boss who used to say that culture is who you hire, who you fire, and who you promote. And that speaks to who the organization values, what behavior the organization values, what behavior it will or won't tolerate, and what behavior is rewarded. And that is what creates culture. So when organizations can really think about how do we change the behaviors and decisions to align with our values, that's when you see real culture shift.
Yeah. And it has to be consistent all the way through.
Yes.
Because if you have a leader at the top, let's say, who isn't
Mhm.
really abiding by that culture, well, that gives permission to others below them to also do the same things. So
Right.
I don't know. I
Exactly.
always find it interesting. I always say culture starts at the top
Yeah.
and it
Yes.
needs to kind of permeate down. But if you see differences than what you're expecting versus the values on the wall, just like you mentioned,
Yeah.
it's really hard to feel like you're connected then with where the organization's going, especially
Yeah.
because those are the people making the big decisions.
For sure. I mean, even values themselves are an interesting thing in organizations, right? I've worked with a lot of organizations to either update or develop new values. And I find that values can either be reflective or aspirational. So reflective values are really like, this is who we are at our core. This is what we're about. And aspirational values are like, this is who we want to be, but we're not there yet. And aspirational values are much harder to sell because they can feel inauthentic because you're not behaving that way today. And that's great to aspire to something, but if you don't change the things that are creating the culture as is, you're never going to get to those aspirational values. And they're going to be just wall dressing instead of something meaningful.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great
Yeah.
distinction. I love that you shared that because I think so many companies will refer to their values in many ways.
Yes.
Like you're not living the values of the company and performance reviews and other kinds of conversations. And so
Right.
if they choose aspirational ones and people don't realize that that's what they are, you know, they're trying to become somebody that they're not yet. And
Right.
even the organization isn't there yet.
Exactly. Yeah. And don't even get me started on performance reviews. We could talk more about performance reviews.
We'll may have to do a separate episode about that. Yeah,
Yeah,
I have my
exactly.
own thoughts on performance reviews as
Same.
well. So we've kind of talked about ghost gaps a little bit, but I know
Yes.
that you have identified 6 different types. I'd love you to
Yes.
walk through those so
Yeah.
people understand what they are.
Sure. So the first one is the power gap. So the power gap is kind of self-explanatory. It's like who has the power to make decisions and who doesn't have power to make decisions. And in really big organizations, those power gaps can be very extreme, right? Again, going back from the top to the bottom of the organization, the more layers you have, the wider those power gaps are going to be. The next one is an opportunity gap. So who gets the opportunities, not just for promotions, but even for skill building and learning and development, or who gets the opportunity to be in the room and who doesn't get the opportunity to be in the room. The next one would be an investment gap. Who do we invest in the organization? And what's really interesting is that in a lot of organizations, most of the investment goes to the people who are already in the top of the organization. Most of the investment is already going to the folks in the corporate office jobs, right? But there's a lot of research that shows that when we invest in the front lines of an organization, those folks become your most loyal leaders over time. And we see that really working in some really big organizations like Costco is a really great example. You know, their CEO started working in one of the warehouses and 20 years later, he's the CEO. You don't see that a lot anymore. You know, you really don't. But that's clear evidence of how when we invest in every level of the workforce, you start to develop this great loyalty and leadership that wouldn't have existed otherwise. The next one is an information gap. And this one I really like to talk about from my work in comms, but there's something in every organization called information asymmetry. So some people have access to more information than others. If you are in one part of the organization, you may get to be invited to a leadership meeting or a town hall meeting that other people don't get invited to. You may have access to an intranet that other people don't have access to. You may get, speeches from the CEO that other people don't hear. So there's always this asymmetry of information that happens in the organization. And information is power. So when people feel uninformed, they feel powerless. And that leads to disengagement. The next one is a visibility gap, which I know you'll appreciate because you are all about visibility. But the key here is that some people are seen and heard and others just go unnoticed. You know, they just go unseen and unnoticed. It's connected to the opportunity gap, but it's kind of about like which voices get heard and which faces get seen every day, day in and day out. And the last one is a purpose gap. So some folks feel much more connected to the purpose of the organization than others do. And surprisingly, this can be one where there's an inverse gap, where the people at the lower level or front line of an organization may feel a higher sense of purpose because they are generally the ones interacting with your customers or clients day to day. You know, the barista at Starbucks may feel a great sense of purpose because he or she is delivering the coffee that brings joy to somebody every morning, versus the person in finance in Starbucks who's working on a spreadsheet all day and doesn't have that purpose connection. And I think that purpose connection is really important because it grounds you to the organization and it grounds you to your work. So those are kind of the 6 gaps I've identified. Who knows? I may decide that there are more once we do even more research, but I will note too that I don't talk about the pay gap as a ghost gap. That's because ghost gaps are invisible and I believe the pay gap is not invisible. It is very, very visible. So it's not talked about in the context of ghost gaps,
Makes
but it
total
is
sense.
important.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I want to dive in just for a second because information gap, I think, is one of the biggest interesting conversations that you just
Yeah.
shared some insights on, and I've seen myself. Where is the disconnect for people? If I'm the CEO, there's a group of people underneath me that are to take the messages that I have and send them down, right? So
Yeah.
that should proliferate. We've got the, telephone game, though. It may not be the
It's
exact
good.
same message, right? We have
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
shortened version.
Yeah.
But are you seeing in many of the companies you worked in, you've been in so many, is it because people don't know how to take those messages and turn them into something that people at the lower levels can understand and comprehend in the best way? Or is it just that they just never realized that they should even be doing that?
I think it's a combination of both. Most communication gets trapped in the messy middle of the organization. So the middle management layer tends to be where a lot of information gets trapped. And it's not necessarily with ill intent. It's that group of folks oftentimes tends to have the most weight on their shoulders. They're leading teams doing day-to-day work, but they're also having to be leaders in the organization. So when information trickles down from the top with the intention of it being cascaded to the bottom, that middle management layer has to decide, like, what is the most important thing I need to communicate, because I may have more limited time with my team than other folks do. So what are the things that they really need to know that is going to impact them day to day, right? I'm making a decision about what's even important to them. So I think it's important to emphasize to middle management the importance of them sharing information. But I think it's also on organizations to take some of that weight off of them and to find ways to communicate directly with all employees so that we are not always relying on an unreliable cascading mechanism. And similarly, I think that some of the onus is on employees ourselves to say, like, if I feel uninformed, where can I get my information? I will tell you from having worked in internal communications for many years that a lot of times, we would put out emails and posters and newsletters and video messages and a conference call. And then you talk to an employee who didn't read any of it, you know, but then that same person will say, well, I don't know what's going on in the company. Well, you just got to take 10 minutes to read your email. So there's a little bit of responsibility that's spread across the organization for folks being more informed. I do think also there's this tendency to be less transparent than we should be out of fear that messages are going to leak or people can't handle it. We don't have all the answers yet, so we can't communicate yet. And I would really urge leaders just um, to push on that notion, because a lot of times you can share more than you think you can. Even if that sharing means I don't know yet. The share could be I don't know. The share can be I'm working on it. And what that's going to do is not just buy you time, but it's going to buy you favor from your employees who feel like, oh, we're in this together because they are sharing with us now instead of waiting 3 months until we find out we're all fired. It's just better to be as transparent as possible. So I think it's kind of this combination of factors to help overcome the information gap. Some of it is organizational, some of it is on the leadership level, and some of it is personal.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I
Yeah.
like that you brought up the transparency thing. I think that, in my experience was one of the best things I ever did was just saying, I'll tell you what I can when I can. And there's
Yeah,
going to be things I know that I can't tell you right away. And I think
exactly.
it just bought so much trust during a very difficult, chaotic time for everyone,
Yeah.
even for me internally, which I wasn't sharing with anyone, of course.
Mhm.
But, I think those are things that really help people feel connected, and it stops all the stories of, well,
Yes.
did you hear this? Did you hear this? Because
Yes,
people will make stuff up. In the absence of information, they will make stuff up.
that's
And
right.
as a leader, you have to be ready for that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big fan of, like, sharing even when you don't have all of the answers. The idea of building trust really is critical to everything that we're talking about today.
Mhm.
Anything we can do to break down silos, create better human connection, that's all going to help us build more trust. And ultimately, that's what really drives engagement as well.
100%.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm in a company And
Yep.
I now know what a ghost gap is, and I can
Oh, this
see
sounds
that.
like a quiz. Okay. Yes.
No quiz, no quiz. There's no A or F here. So I know that there's issues, and I know that you have a framework that is intended to help people start looking towards ways to solve this. So can you walk
Yes.
through your 4I framework?
Yeah. So my 4I framework is inform, involve, inspire, and invest. So these are 4 words that stand for things people can do at the personal level or at the organizational level to start to narrow the ghost gaps. So inform, again, is all about closing those information gaps, addressing information asymmetry throughout the organization. So at the organizational level, it can be looking at your communication tactics, mechanisms, and infrastructure to think about how do we ensure that everybody is getting the information that they need. And then on the personal level, it's how do I get myself more informed? How do I make the effort to read the materials that are coming at me or attend the meetings that I'm invited to? Involve is all about inclusion. So at the organizational level, how can we involve more people in more projects? How can we make sure that people's voices are heard in decisions? How do we involve more teams in meetings, whatever it may be? You know, I worked somewhere that had different meetings for their corporate staff and their field staff. And I came in and the first thing I did was create one singular meeting for everybody so that everybody felt connected. And it made a world of difference. It's a minor example. It didn't require extra work. It really didn't. So that's an example of involve. And at the personal level, similarly, like, how do I raise my hand for projects? Maybe my company has employee resource groups. Can I join as a leader of an employee resource group? How do I just make myself more seen and visible and get more involved? Inspire is all about that purpose gap. How do we feel more connected? And at the organizational level, it's again about really creating a vision that people can attach their hearts and minds to, you know, people that people can feel passionate about. Um, you know, does our mission and vision and values align with our culture? You know, all of those things help inspire people. And even setting a business strategy that makes sense to people, that has some kind of long-term outlook that people can feel inspired by. And similarly, on the personal level, how do you get yourself inspired at work? You know, how do you create that connection? If you're the person who works in finance on the spreadsheets, how do you make sure that you can feel a sense of purpose in what you do every day? You can find that for yourself. I like to relay the story of JFK was touring NASA one year, and there was a janitor pushing a mop. And JFK introduced himself to the janitor and asked the janitor, "What do you do here?" And the janitor said, "I help put men on the moon." He didn't say, "I mop the floors" or "I clean the toilets." He had a very clear understanding that his work there in that space served a purpose that ultimately led to this really cool thing that we were able to achieve. And I would encourage folks to try to find that for themselves. You know, I worked in a lot of different industries, and in some industries it's easier to do than others. You know, when I worked for Target, I could go walk into a Target store and I'm the Target shopper. And so I feel like this sense of connection to what I'm doing. But I was able to find that even working in manufacturing. You know, I worked for a steel company and I don't buy rolls and plates of commercial steel, but I do go on roller coasters or walk across bridges or look at windmills that are made with the steel that my team made. Those are all ways to feel a sense of purpose. So I'd encourage everyone to do that. And if you can't do that, then maybe it's time to question if this is the right place for you. And that's okay too. And the last thing is invest. So at the organizational level, it means investing in folks more equally, thinking about where you're making the investments of time, energy, and resources. You know, as a leader, even as a manager, invest can mean, how am I investing my time into my team in an equal way? Am I meeting with this one person all the time and never meeting? I haven't seen that person in 3 months. So even the resource of your time is an important investment as a leader. And then for yourself, investment can mean, how do I invest in my skills, in my education, in my future, and in my career in a way that's meaningful to me? And that might be in the context of the workplace, and it might be outside of it. You know, I went and got my master's degree while I was working as a corporate VP. These are things that we do to invest in ourselves. And I would encourage everyone to take those kinds of steps to improve your own experience at work and outside of it.
Wow, some great examples of each
Yeah.
of those really from the business perspective. And I like the business perspective and the personal perspective
Yeah,
because it all starts with us, in many ways, right? How
it
we
does.
see our work and what we do.
Yeah. I mean, I say the workplace isn't fair, but at the same time, you have agency in it, and I don't want people to feel powerless. I want them to feel empowered in the context of that organization to navigate their way in a way that makes sense for them.
Yeah, makes total sense.
Yeah.
So again, I'm in an organization and I can see all these things and maybe I'm in HR or maybe
Yep.
I'm in a different part of the organization, but I'm having trouble helping other people see it. And
Hmm.
you made a comment about it's not about managing resistance, it's about earning buy-in and making change that lasts. So can you talk about the earning buy-in piece? Because I think that is something that, probably a business case would have to be built around some of the things, especially if there are investments involved.
Yeah. I think, the key to change in any organization is really appealing both to people's hearts and minds. There's this tendency to really rationalize change, right? We're going to rationalize this change because it's going to optimize performance and shareholder returns. But what we don't do is really appeal to people's heart and emotion about how their life will improve or how the lives of our clients and customers will improve as a result of this change. And you cannot get people on board with lasting change by only appealing to their rationality because we are not purely rational beings. There's this great book called The Switch by Chip Heath. And it really talks about this concept of the elephant and the rider. So the elephant is like your emotional side and the rider is your rational side. And you may think that the rider can control that elephant, but the elephant has a mind of its own and it will just run into a wall or run right out of the circus if you let it, right? So it's important then that you understand and appeal to both of those aspects. And I think, again, too often in change management within organizations, we're thinking too much about the rational business case of something and not really thinking about the human centered impact of what the change is going to be. When you start to do that, when you start to approach change from a human centered perspective, that's when you can create change that lasts because you are appealing to folks on a different level than you are
Mhm.
otherwise.
Love that. I'm so glad we talked about that. I think
Yeah,
that's so important. And I do think that's a missing piece,
it is.
I
Yeah.
just, I
Yeah.
don't see enough discussion around that. Let's just say that.
Yeah. I mean, and the reality is that a lot of these big changes have a human impact. When you're talking about reorganizing a company or relocating a corporate headquarters, that is not something that you can expect people to get on board with simply because of the rational decision behind it. You can't say we're relocating our corporate office from one state to another because we're going to optimize our tax breaks and be closer to our operations. Meanwhile, you have hundreds of people on the hook for whether or not they want to move or are going to lose their jobs. So you have to approach it from a human centered way because the impact is always human, no matter what the decision is.
Mhm. I think that's some of the struggle right now with the mandatory return to work
Yes.
situations, right? It's not really being sold as this is good for you as an employee. It's more, it's good for the company, for various reasons. So
Yeah.
I think there are opportunities to maybe adopt some of the things you're talking about here to help
Hmm.
people see why going back to the office could be a good thing for them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. You have to sell it in a different way if you want to get the outcome that you
Right.
want. But you also have to be realistic. I mean, a decision like return to work has a disparate impact on certain populations in your employee base. And so you have to understand that very clearly when you make those decisions. And if that's a risk you're okay with, then that's fine. But it's not okay to do it flippantly without understanding what those impacts are.
Yeah. Love this. Is there anything else I didn't ask you about that you wanted to share about what you're doing or maybe what's next for you?
One thing I wanted to share is that I mean, you know from your work that being a solopreneur is a challenge in and of itself, and it's crazy times we're living in. And I think it's so important that we support and uplift and empower one another. So one of the things I've done is join forces with 3 other women speakers to form what we are calling the North Star Speaker Collective. And this is 3 other speakers. One is a neuroscientist, one is a leadership coach, one is a former BBC frontline reporter. We all have very different voices, but we're all trying to help organizations find clarity through the chaos. And for me, it's not just about, presenting us as a business, but it's about, uplifting women's voices in particular. And so I appreciate that you're doing this podcast and just know that there's solidarity and sisterhood here. And we're also continuing to try to do similar work as a collective.
I love that you're doing that. It doesn't have to be a huge networking group. It can be
Right.
4 people coming together that raise their voices together. That can be a little louder than they could be individually. And
Absolutely.
really with different perspectives, right? Different ideas. I like the creative innovation around just small, even collaborations where you just have different conversations than you can have with others.
Absolutely.
And I know one of those other voices and I love her. She's amazing. And I think you're really smart to bring you guys together and just start to see what can happen. What can you create based on that?
Yeah.
So I love that you guys are doing it.
Mhm.
Okay. I just wanted to move into the 4 questions that we ask every guest.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to hear what your answers are. So the first one
Great.
is, what is visibility and why did you answer that way?
Visibility is being seen, right? I mean, visibility is not just being seen, but seeing others. And I think it's so important right now. It's so easy for us to feel invisible, especially like social media and all of these other things. Like, you know, eyeballs are dollars right now, right? And it can feel very inauthentic. And it's like leaves a lot of people feeling like, how can I feel seen and heard in this sea of inauthentic visibility? So I think we also maybe should think about visibility a little differently in that it's not just about, you don't have to have the Super Bowl halftime show stage to be visible. Love Bad Bunny though, so we won't go there. It's like, how can I make a difference within my circle of influence? I think that level of visibility is just as important. And we talked about the visibility gap as one of my ghost gaps. So, it's something that's very personal to me about kind of creating your own visibility in the workplace as well, and not just letting yourself be invisible.
Mhm. Yeah, let you have the agency to do something different that really
Exactly.
can develop you as a
Yeah.
person,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Okay, what are you doing to be visible?
Yeah. Well, I'm doing a number of things to be visible. I just knocked on social media, but I'm doing it myself, right? Um, building up LinkedIn influence and all of those things. Forming the collective is another way of building visibility by leveraging the visibility of each other to help raise our collective visibility. And I'm doing things like just getting out there with organizations, even organizations I may not have thought of before. I just did a speaking gig with Association of Women in the Metal Industries, and I was in steel for a long time. And I'm like, I'm just trying to get visibility with women's groups and get in front of groups that I feel like I can really help and support. And so those are the things I'm doing to build visibility.
And so needed. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is the best leadership or career advice you've ever received?
So the best advice I ever received was forget about getting a mentor and find yourself a sponsor. And so I even do workshops on this topic, the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. The reality is that women are over mentored and under sponsored. So you could have a mentor for 30 years and be in the same job you started in 30 years ago, right? The sponsor is the person who's going to talk about you when you're not in the room. The sponsor is the person who's going to help get you on a project that you wouldn't have otherwise been on. The sponsor is the person who is going to put your name in the hat for a promotion. So mentors are great. They provide advice and guidance, but a sponsor is the one who gives you the capital to really elevate your career. And there's a key difference there in the role and function of those folks in your life.
100% agree. Yes, I've
Yeah.
seen a lot of great people. And even when I went to a conference, supply chain conference years ago, I was going as the head of the Women at Craft Employee Resource Group just to understand the gap with women in supply chain. And at that point, I think they said they were well over 1 million people short, not just with women, but in general, that 1 million jobs were going to be open. I don't know. That's probably changed now, but at that point in time, but then there was an all male panel up there
Mhm.
talking about the gap with women specifically, which I thought was really interesting to have that perspective, right? But one of the men who spoke was a plant manager who had purposely been identifying high potential female talent and
Yes.
put them into positions to stretch them and develop them, but also kept an eye over
Mhm.
them, right? To help them succeed and not to fail. And I thought that was really amazing to hear him do that. And hopefully it inspired other people
Yeah.
in the room to start to think about doing that for themselves too. Because I mean, it takes a village, right? For
Yeah.
everybody
Yeah.
to succeed in many ways,
Yeah.
but especially in stretched positions where they're uncomfortable, you don't want them to, backslide into something else.
Yeah, that's amazing. That sounds like that was a person who really got it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, it is. I mean, it is important for women to have male sponsors. We'll just, put it bluntly. Men will tend to have larger networks or have more positions of power, and that's the unfortunate reality that we're still in. Same goes for people of color, generally have
Mhm.
fewer folks in their network. And so the more we have those men in power recognizing the talent and reaching down to bring other folks up the ladder, the better.
Okay, a book that you've read recently or that you love that you want to share with the audience.
So I recently read a book called Fantastic Land by Mike Bakoven. And this is not a book that's related to work in any way, but you asked me about a book and I'm like, well, who says it has to be work related? So this book is like Lord of the Flies meets Disneyland. It's about this fictional amusement park and this fictional hurricane hits a fictional Florida, and the workers at an amusement park are left trapped for months, not rescued after this hurricane, and they split up into factions and chaos ensues. So it's a little Stephen King. It's a little, like I said, it's a little Disney and a little Stephen King put together. I love those kinds of novels. Stephen King and Dean Koontz and all those authors are kind of right up my alley. I loved it because it was written in a really unique way. The whole book it's interviews, fictional interviews that are being told to a reporter. So you start to piece together the story based on the interviews of the folks who lived through it.
Oh, I
Anyway,
love that.
I share it because it's really unique. It's an interesting read. It's a little bit of escapism from everything else that's going on from your job. You don't have to always read Tony Robbins books. And there's something in it that just really speaks to human nature, both good and bad, and the sense of tribalism. And maybe, it relates in many ways to my talk about the workplace being this ecosystem with a bunch of gaps and, teams against each other. And so anyway, so that's what I would recommend.
Love that. I love the approach of the interviews, of the
Right.
people in
It's
this
really
for
unique.
yeah, I think that's really clever. Oh, I love that. I wanted to share a couple things.
Yeah.
So, you wrote an amazing article on LinkedIn that kind of highlights a lot of what we talked about today, but you are a great writer.
Oh,
Like
thank you.
it was written really well, and I will include the link for everyone to read it yourself. It was really highlighting the importance of what you're doing and what you're seeing and starting to really put your voice out there around everything else that you're doing. So I love that. And kudos to you for
Thank you.
starting to put your voice out there in a bigger way. So I love
Yeah.
that. I did want to share all of your information. So is there a place that you want people to go to learn more about you?
Sure. You can go to my website, YvonneFurneaux.com. If you're interested in any of the consulting work, it's empowerupconsulting.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Ivonne Furneaux. You can find me on YouTube at Ivonne Furneaux, and you can find me on Instagram at Yvonne in real life. So lots of places where you can find me.
So that was what struck me when I read all of your different links was in real life. I love that so much for your Instagram. Yes, because then we have to worry about that now that you are actually you, I guess, right?
It's actually me in the flesh. Yes. I'm not a bot yet.
So thanks for being on the show. Thanks for what you're doing. I think it's so important. And I love the language that you're using to help people really start to understand the ghost gaps and everything else that they can start to do for themselves to improve their experience in the culture through understanding of your gaps and how to solve them. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I had a great time and I always love chatting with you.
I do too. So maybe more in the future, everyone. You just never know. We might talk about performance reviews or something.
Maybe we'll start our new, the Visibility Collective. I don't know.
There you go. Yes, there you go. All right. Excellent. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining today on the Visibility Factor podcast, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks so much for listening to the Visibility Factor podcast. Remember that visibility starts with small steps that are intentional and consistent each day. Be bold, be visible, be the leader you were meant to be. Find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Follow us on all of our social media platforms, which are highlighted in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Visibility Factor podcast.